Yeah, no, I think that the notion of the incarnation, the Christian notion there, is precisely that,
Right.
the deepest meaning of the incarnation is not something that happened 2,000 years ago. That was just what made us aware of something that's happening in every creative moment, which is that the divine is coming into, say, human form into the material world, it's creative. That's how you know that it's happened. You know, so for example, I don't know, I think music is a very good example of this, that music is this strange thing that it's kind of in between worlds, that it is both a physical thing, it's acoustic, but if you just assess all music by its acoustic properties, you get absolutely nowhere.
That's right.
But the question is then, where does what you assess music by kind of come from? And there would be a sort of more a narrower romantic view that would say, for example, it's the power of expression and so on, but that doesn't really feel to take you very far, and it doesn't again have this sense that, you know, when you've listened to Mozart or also Bach, say particularly, you know, that your experience of life has greatly grown. It's not just your expression, but something's been given to you. And you know, Barfield thought that that's because the music both does something on the horizontal, but also transposes, as he puts it, something from the vertical as well. And that's why it exists in this. It's in the imaginal zone, in an intermediate zone.
Very much.
Yeah.
So
does that? I'm not quite sure if I fully answered what you were saying there.
No, that picks up on it. So let me try and feed it back to you through what you said. What I'm trying to suggest is, and you can think of Winnicott here also, the transitional object and serious play. When I'm involved in serious playing of and with music, right? And especially like if I'm doing something like jazz, where I'm actually not just listening, but feeding back in creatively. Right? That when there's a notion of creativity there that transcends the making or transcends the expressive notions of creativity and gives us a sense of, and we can only participate here. I'll try a bold hypothesis, and then you can criticize it if you want. But we only can participate in the creativity that is God's agapic love when we can get to that kind of creativity to some degree in ourselves, or actually between us and the world. And music is something like that. I think that's why music is so prevalent when people are trying to get their most, pertinent representations or symbols of the experience of sacredness. They often resort to music and musical analogies. It's pervasive through Taoism. As you probably know, I'm a Tai Chi Chuan player. And notice the word, by the way, I'm a Tai Chi Chuan player, right? That's the Chinese, right? And so, let me give you an analogy from that tradition, then I'll give it back to you and see if we are getting in sync. You don't really understand the Tao until you play Tai Chi. And then you get that musical sense of you're participating in a kind of creativity. As you say, it's not a creativity even of a work of art. It's a creativity of a way of being. And that discloses to you in a participatory fashion the creativity of ways of being that is the Tao. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that resonating with you? Is that landing for you?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. The music analogy works for me because I play the piano.
There you go.
And I remember when I first started having jazz improvisation lessons, for example, and I thought that I was going to be given this kind of magic that I'd suddenly just be able to start playing jazz. And then I spent the next 5 years basically doing scales.
Right.
And the point of that is that all that work is required.
Yes.
Your participation in this whole musical cosmos is required before maybe something else can start to kind of, as it were, flow through your fingers.
Right.
Now I've never actually, I'm not very good at jazz at all. Really, I'm not. But what it did help me experience on occasion is sheet music. Every so often, you realise that the music is kind of playing you, rather than you trying to play the music. And
that's
so
what I'm talking
that
about.
Flip that happens every so often, which reminds so the Tao, playing with the Tao, as it were. I wonder whether there's a similar kind of experience.
So what I'm trying to get is that flip you just did. That to me, it's conducive or affording of the flip to agape, the flip from being egocentric to being anthrocentric. You belong to the music rather than the music belongs to you. But it's not a passive belonging. It's not like you're just right. That's what I'm trying to get at.
That I wanted to have it. And so the idea of emphasizing creation and the script in Genesis, if people who watch my videos will know that I really focus a lot on that symbolism. Like I tend to go back to the first chapters of Genesis as kind of like the pattern making. You can imagine it almost like as if the Bible has this first part, which is really this enunciation of the patterns. It's almost like a fugue, like a Bach fugue, where you have the theme, which is announced at the beginning. Then you have like a kind of variation on the themes, which appears all through Scripture, where they're repeated, set against each other. There's this interplay of the pattern. It kind of opens up, and then at the end in Revelation, it's restated at a higher level, where the first image of the garden is now the last image of the garden with the city, and this kind of glorious moment where everything comes together and death is destroyed, and all the problems that were said about in the first chapter are kind of resolved. So
that's so interesting, because I'm reading through Echoes of Exodus by Alistair Roberts, and he starts out right at the very beginning saying we need to read the scripture musically. And he has like his beginning chapter, man, is just absolutely fantastic, where, like you said, it's like you take all of these different elements of music and you look at the motif and melody and how those play out, and that's really what's happening in the written form or a linguistic form in the biblical text. And
well, the ancients, when they use the word music, so for example, if you look at the classical curriculum, one of the elements was music. And so you would think that music just meant singing or just meant learning to play an instrument, but it's not clear that that's what it meant. It seems to mean a lot more. When we talk about the music of the spheres, for example, like in a Pythagorean sense, then we're actually not just talking about sound in the sense of what you hear, but it's actually the perception of pattern. And so music, it's almost like pure pattern. That's what music is. It's one of the closest thing to a mathematical formula that you can experience is to recognize amongst abstract sounds a pattern. It's pretty amazing.
The way that Neil said it in our conversation was that music presents reality, or it presents that which is beyond our five senses.
Yeah, that's what it does. And it does it. And there's a priority of sound in Scripture. And I think that it's probably not just in Scripture. It might be a universal thing, because sound is invisible, and it's experienced. The causality of sound is not easy to perceive, right? So when you see something, you can see it like happening, right? And so the causality is there in front of you, but sound kind of drops in, from above, let's say, and it's carried by wind, and it's carried by spirit, basically, and it also comes from the person's mouth, so it carries meaning directly. And so the idea of sound and singing, let's say, as being the primordial language, is something that you find in many cultures. You find that in there's a lot of early kind of mythological type texts that will talk about singing as the song, the world was sung into being, or that the idea of the language of the angels, for example, is like the language of the birds, and it's this singing that comes from the heavens.